As I listen to Carolyn Shaw's Partita for 8 voices, I interpret this music in my body. As the performers count me in, I can imagine what it feels like to execute these square dance moves. As the performers' overlapping speech erupt into homorhythmic song, I can feel my voice on the edge of catching as my vocal track creates the space for an ah sound.
To the side.
To the side.
To the side.
And around.
Through the middle
To
and
the side.
To the side.
to the side.
And around.
Through the middle
To the
and
side.
To the side.
to the side.
To the side.
And around.
And around and around
And around and around.
To the side. 2, 3, 4,
And
5.
across.
6.
7, 8.
Through the midpoint.
Of the line drawn from the left side.
Allemande, left and around.
Allemande left and around.
Allemande and around.
Conversely, over the course of this 4-movement piece, Roomful of Teeth creates sounds that I'm not capable of feeling in my body. I cannot eat my sound, the multi-step tongue filter that we heard at the end of the previous excerpt. Other sounds feel like they constrict my vocal cords, silencing my voice, like the Inuit breathing game and the Tuvan throat singing in the 3rd movement. In these cases, I feel more like a spectator rather than a participant in the music. In her program notes, Shaw describes, quote, spontaneous applause and cheering at the explosive return of the D major chord near the end, end quote, during the premiere of Passacaglia, the 4th movement of this piece, suggesting that others feel a bodily engagement with this piece. They feel invited to participate in the music with their voice and their body. Anna Fulton, in her recent SMT presentation, explored this mimetic engagement as a metaphor for the music unveiling and striving, discussing this particular passage as an unveiling of the voice in an apotheosis-like reprise of not just the 4th movement, but the entire piece, hearkening back to the passage from the 1st movement that I played at the beginning of this presentation.
In that 86, 87, and 88 points across the century vertical axis. And the 65th points on the lower right corner, 86 point, 87, level 88 point, 86.
In a similar way, I hear these moments as inviting the listener to participate in the joy of communal music making. The varying degrees of mimetic invitation throughout the piece, coupled with the intertextual references pointing to musical tradition that exists in community, explores the opposition between individuality and community. The listening experience is shaped through this embodied metaphor, casting the listener as an active agent in the creation of a musical community. Arnie Cox describes this embodied understanding of music through mimetic engagement. We comprehend music as, quote, kind of physical empathy that involves imagining making the sounds we are listening to, end quote. These mimetic musical images rise to different levels of consciousness and may be overt or covert, and can occur in response to any acoustic feature. My experience of covert mimetic engagement with Partita and the audience's overt response to Passacaglia points to how this piece motivates participation. The ways in which we are invited to respond and their corresponding phenomenological experience, which are colored by our cultural contexts, inform not just an individual's aesthetic judgment, but the meaning of the composition. A point also explored in Kate Heidman's essay about vocal timbre. As described earlier, this composition affords different degrees of mimetic invitation, and on this chart I've listed the musical features that afford high and low degrees of mimetic musical imagery. I am more likely to be fully immersed in the music when the 8 voices come together to form a single musical stream, producing sounds that I, as an untrained vocalist, can imagine creating. I mapped these parameters over the course of the first movement and noted relative high points in the degree of mimetic invitation at the bottom of this chart, a methodology inspired by Judith Lockhead's analytical work. Solid orange represents the highest level of mimetic invitation. There's a ton of information on this chart, and as a warning, it isn't quite to scale. If you have the time, I suggest pausing the video here to listen to the entire first movement while following this chart. I've also included this chart as a handout for easier viewing. The time points refer to the 2013 recording of this piece, readily found on YouTube. Looking at these mimetic trajectories of these musical parameters, a few interesting patterns emerge. First, dynamics tend to grow gradually into these relative high points of mimetic invitation, while other parameters, notably texture and timbre, tend to abruptly shift at these moments. 2. In the first 2 sections, the timbral trajectories are similar. They start with spoken word, move to a bright, open, unrounded high point, before receding with darker vowels that are back and rounded, and concluding with a nasal hum. This shape of growth to a high point before receding back is also mirrored by the dynamics in each section. 3. Contour and meter less reliably follow these trends. Only the first and last sections feature parallel motion between the voices at moments of heightened mimetic engagement. The meter is clearly expressed in the first section and gradually becomes less clearly expressed as the piece continues. For me, the most reliable parameters that elicit a strong mimetic response are texture, dynamics, and timbre. These are moments where the 8 distinct voices fold into a single loud stream, singing vowels whose placement encourages a sympathetic smile in the listener. This sonic metaphor of the individuals coming together to create a unified sound motivates my mapping of individual and community as seen on this slide. This mapping is supported by intertextual references throughout the piece from various American vernacular traditions. The use of intertextual references to Western art composers and other Shaw compositions was recently explored by Owen Belcher, and this piece also has its share of classical intertextual references, such as music from the American vocal experimentalist tradition and the Baroque dance suite. This piece also references instances of community-driven music creation. The first movement uses calls found in several folk dancing traditions. For example, the call, sides, forward, and back. Performing dances such as square dances must occur in community. It is impossible to practice this tradition individually, as practitioners are painfully aware during this pandemic. As another example, the third movement includes an extensive quote from Shining Shore, whose lyrics appear on this slide. Also used by Charles Ives in his compositions, this hymn was quite popular during the Civil War, sung by soldiers on both sides of the conflict, although it quickly declined in popularity in the 20th century. Even so, the pentatonic melody, regular phrase structure, and homophonic setting evokes congregational hymn singing, another example of communal music creation. Returning to my reading of the first movement, a crescendo precedes each of these moments of heightened mimetic invitation, as if more voices are joining in. As a listener, I feel surrounded by voice, like one in a crowd. But in each section of this movement, the heightened mimetic invitation explores a different facet of creating music in community. In the first section, once the critical mass is reached, the timbre switches to a bright sound, and the textural complexity abruptly thins. The melody joyfully leaps in parallel motion, as if it was celebrating the act of creating an unified sound out of many voices. In the second section, the moment of heightened mimetic imagery is conveyed by a clear meter, articulated in part by the chords changing every 4 beats. Despite not using the homophonic texture present in the first section, it connects back to the section through the use of a similar chord progression. Preceding this moment, the lowest voice sings, "Find a way back home." And during the moment of heightened mimetic imagery, voices sing dance calls until they find home, a D major chord sung on ah. While the first section felt like a spontaneous celebration of community, this second section feels effortful, striving towards that D major chord with the ascending bass line. In the third section, the voices are clearly delineated into 2 distinct layers, with an A-metric unison melody floating above an E major chord. While I can experience the embodied metaphor of togetherness at this point, I don't feel included in the same way as I did in the first 2 sections. I'm not singing along or dancing along in the moment. Rather, I feel time suspended, almost like a memory or echo of the previous 2 sections. In the first movement, I experienced communal celebration and striving for community, as well as the reminiscence of being in community, through mimetic invitation and attenuation. The narrative arc of the fourth movement takes a different path. This movement is built on a repeated chord progression as seen on this slide. This progression, sung with a back rounded all, has a few interesting moments. The return to D major feels early, as the rhythmic pattern is disrupted, and the leaps into F sharp major chord remind me of the leaps in the first movement as the rhythm continues to accelerate. These leaps are contrasted with the chromatic half-note triplets that conclude this progression. As shown in this slide, each subsequent progression begins louder and brighter than the previous one, but the end of each progression reverts to the piano all sound. So while the chord progression slowly accumulates more signifiers of community, it is immediately contrasted with a more reflective, less inclusive sound. At this point in the movement, voices slowly gain more individuality. As a listener, the mimetic invitation is attenuated. Fewer voices sing the complete chord progression on the 4th, 5th, and 6th iterations of the theme, while the number of independent lines increase. In the 6th iteration, only hints of the chord progression remain, as the vocalists read from Sol DeWitt's drafting instructions. As we heard at the beginning of this presentation, individual voices are layered on top of each other, not trying to outshout each other, but talking past each other, until all that is left is a constriction of the sound and a low vocal fry that gradually crescendos into a bright, jubilant ah. This sudden release of the many becoming one feels more like a mimetic demand rather than just an invitation, I can't help but to subvocally participate. As I close these analytical vignettes, I want to turn to Shaw's opening remarks on Partita's score. These remarks emphasize the embodied human found in this piece. This love of the human voice, this love of movement, plus the basic desire to connect, informs my reading of this piece. While one can argue that Partita's success derives from its accessible musical surface, post-minimalist diatonicism, strong rhythmic pulse, and melodic repetition throughout all movements, I argued in this presentation that the varying degrees of mimetic invitation remind the listener of the joy of living and performing in community, which translates to its general public acclaim. As observed by Jeremy Jeffin, the chair of the 2013 Pulitzer jury, quote, "She changes gears so quickly and so easily. Every turn is so unexpected and so full of joy," end quote. Many times these abrupt changes arrive at a place of greatest mimetic invitation. This discussion has been rooted in a subjective bodily way of knowing this music, and as such it raises the important question, whose voice and body is represented in this analysis, as Kuzik's 1994 article reminds us. While I, as a white cisgendered female, can experience a narrative of communal joy in this composition, others may experience a systematic oppression of the voice and of the other, as sounds I can't imagine singing are exploited and exoticized, as discussed in David's 2019 article. For instance, the third movement can be felt not just as the exploitation and exoticization of the Inuit breathing game, but the subjugation, as the hymn colonizes and eventually extinguishes the Inuit tradition. Considering degrees of mimetic engagement and the way it shapes musical meaning as situated in the analyst speaks to the wider concern of inclusivity in our field. If the way we understand music in our bodies directly affects not just which music is selected for analysis, but how we think about and discuss it, then it becomes even more essential that diverse voices are included on programming committees and editorial boards. Cox states, quote, "We cannot specify the nature and strength of these mimetic-based meaning for any individual in response to a particular work or passage a priori. What we can do instead is describe motivated and likely responses, and we can anticipate that members of a population may share a similar response," end quote. But if certain populations are underrepresented or not represented on these committees that decide conference programming and the content of journals, voices whose embodied experiences of music differ from the majority remain unheard. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to discussing this presentation with you at the question session.